Okay, now I'm recording. Okay, we're just getting back into it. I was just talking about some other stuff for those of you who are just joining the video right now. We're getting into the meat of it. Right? Last time we were talking about arguments for the existence of God, and I had to specify what we mean by God because there are different God concepts. And I then went on to describe what traditional theism is, right? And so now when we're looking at arguments for the existence of God, these are just classic arguments for that particular God concept, which is the main one historically and traditionally, right? Where God is some sort of personal being and God is infinite and has all these attributes like omniscience and omnipotence, right? God knows everything and is all powerful, and God is all good, right? We looked at all those. If you need a reminder of that, just click on traditional theism, and that will tell you. And then we looked at some terminology as well, so you're familiar with terms like theism and atheism and agnosticism. It's helpful to know these terms, right? Okay. So, arguments for the existence of God. We did a few of them, so let me skip through those. The ontological argument, right, which is basically God exists, is an analytic truth, right? Is one way to put it. But that has its problems that we looked at. And then we looked at two cosmological arguments. And cosmological arguments pretty much tend to point to the cosmos, the universe around us, right? And we see that the universe, like all the things within the universe, right? We seek explanations, we seek understanding of why things are the way they are and where things came from and how they got there and things like that. And so because we apply that kind of reasoning to objects within the universe, there's also a kind of a philosophical temptation to think, well, then it also makes sense to ask that about the universe as a whole, right? So that's what cosmological arguments do. They basically see the existence of the universe as kind of a problem to be solved, right? It's kind of a question of why is all this stuff here, right? Sometimes people ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And cosmological arguments basically try to say that the only good explanation for the existence of the universe is a God, right? Or is God traditionally defined as this creative being with a mind and the power to create a universe. So that's cosmological arguments. And there are a few different problems, just like with the previous one, the ontological argument. I'm not going to review all this again. I can just see myself wanting to review it quickly and then talking about it for far too long. And we talked about all this stuff last time, so I'm going to go right through it. We looked at argument from design, right? The design argument. Okay, so before I move on, let me just point out something, okay? Both of these arguments, the argument from design and the cosmological argument, both of them seem to function in a very similar way, which is basically they are what is called an inference to the best explanation, right? You see some sort of phenomena that you're trying to explain, and then you think to yourself, well, what would explain it, right? That's how these work. So, for example, just the existence of the universe itself, right? Where's all this stuff come from? What's the explanation? And then you might say, well, traditional religions have talked about a powerful being, an immaterial spirit who is very, very wise and all powerful. That would explain it, right? So therefore, probably that being exists. Right? That's the pattern of these arguments. That there's something that's crying out for explanation, and then there's the idea that the concept of God, the traditional one, would provide this solution to this problem, would provide an explanation for these questions that we have. Questions like, why is all this here, and how can it be that we are so well designed, apparently for specific purposes? And God seems to be a candidate as for an answer to these questions. But then there are problems with that, because on the one hand, look, okay, if you already believe in God, right? If you already are quite certain that the traditional God or something like it exists, then of course you're going to assume that God is behind it all, right? That makes sense if you already have that belief, right? But these arguments are not supposed to just be for people who already believe in God. These arguments are supposed to show you, right? If you start out with not believing in God, if you start out with just not having a belief, being like one of these atheist aliens who don't have any particular belief about God, but who wonder, well, should I? Are there good arguments for it? If you then present these arguments, are they as compelling and as persuasive? Well, no, not really. Right? If you already believe in God, it's going to be very easy to believe that God designed and created the universe. But if you don't already believe in God, then all you really have is, well, perhaps some mysteries about the nature of the universe. But simply because someone came up with an explanation doesn't mean that therefore that explanation must actually be true. Right? That's the only good explanation that there is. And in many cases, it's also problematic because, for example, in the case of the argument for design, the very thing that we were trying to explain is this kind of level of wonderfulness and complexity that we see in the world around us, and a desire to explain that wonderfulness and complexity. Now, science has a way to explain wonderfulness and complexity. Right? Science breaks it down into simpler elements. So that we can explain, for example, why there are all these different species that exist today. We can look at the history of these species and these organisms over millions of years and evolution that's taken place and things like that. Or you can explain the behavior of a molecule by looking at it at an atomic level, right? We can break it down into smaller parts. We can do all this kind of stuff. And that's why science is usually reductionistic, right? It reduces complex phenomena to more simple phenomena that we can understand better. That's what counts as a scientific explanation, right? You're explaining the complex in terms of the less complex. Whereas when you go the theistic route, when you say that a God explains it all, then what you're saying is all this complex, wonderful stuff is explained by something even more wonderful and complex, right? But then you have this problem of an infinite regress, right? We did talk about this. I said I wasn't going to rehash it all, but that's the point I wanted to make again, right? Then in a way you could see that it's kind of circular or leads to this infinite regress. If you imagine that wonderful, amazing stuff that we observe in the universe must always have some explanation that is even more wonderful than it is, then where do you stop, right? How do we account for God's wonderfulness and complexity, right? If we look at a human being and think, well, that couldn't have just evolved, right? That couldn't just exist without an intelligent being creating it. Well, now let's look in the same way that we looked at human beings at God, at this being who made all these other beings. Right? What explains this being? How could there just exist a being with a mind who can come up with human beings and plants and animals and things like that? How can that simply just exist? Right? Now, a Christian will say that that's a nonsensical question because God is the end of explanation, right? God is what I called last time a brute fact. All good and well if you are already someone who believes in God, right? Like I said. But if you're not, if you're on the fence or if you're just not sure about it at all, it's a lot harder to get to this idea that God must exist for this very reason, right? Because it simply pushes the question mark farther out there in a way, right? So we have a question about how it is that we wonderful beings can just exist, and we think, okay, well, God would explain it, but then you'd have simply another, wow, wonderful being. Right? Well, how do we explain that? A theist will have to say it's a brute fact. But then the problem is that someone who only observes the natural universe and does not believe that God exists already, hasn't been convinced of that, they could simply say that the universe as a whole is a brute fact, right? That the universe as a whole simply must exist, right? that individual components, we can always explain this in terms of this and this in terms of this. So we can look at all these dependency relationships within the universe, that explanations make sense within the universe, but that the universe, if by universe we literally mean all of reality, right, whatever that encapsulates, then the universe might simply be a brute fact. Yeah, exactly, right. The argument from design that posits a creator God with a mind and an intelligence is explaining the very complex, right, life, with something even more complex, right? Somehow a spiritual entity with a mind, and the imagination that is required to come up with the idea of human beings and other forms of life, right? And notice, again, if we're really taking this seriously, the idea that God is a person with a mind, then it's got to be something like that. It's got to be something like God comes up, right? Out of what materials? How does this actually work, right? So we somehow can't believe that human beings could just emerge naturally out of the fabric of the universe, but yet people imagine it's very easy to think of the idea of a human being simply popping into the fabric of the mind of God, right? Really, if you really think about it, you realize that you're kind of just transposing all your questions into a much more mysterious realm, and then you're sort of being okay with that mystery. Because I don't think most theists really try to think about what it means to say that God has a mind, right? It rather all becomes rather mysterious, and part of being a religious believer, I think part of it is simply being okay with that mystery. But then again, that same option is available to the more naturalistic, scientific leaning kind of person, right? You could any even a hardcore atheist who really believes in science should still be able to admit that the universe, all of reality, is vast and unimaginably complex and huge, and there's so much mystery out there, right? What human beings know, even the smartest human being, only knows a fraction of what's going on all out there in the whole world, right? We don't even know if this visible universe is the only universe. So a scientific leaning, naturalistic leaning atheist could also say the same thing, that, well, the universe itself is a brute fact, and much of it is very mysterious, and I don't know the answer to everything. But here it is, and here I am. Yeah. So it's not clear that a person like that is going to be convinced that God must exist, because you end up with the same kind of position where you have to say, well, I don't know it all. I don't have all the answers, right? And you have to live with a brute fact. You have to live with things that are unexplained, right? So those things are not necessarily motivations for becoming a theist, for becoming someone who believes in God if you don't already believe in God. It just doesn't really make sense, right? If you're already living with uncertainty and the existence of a brute fact, right, and bringing God into it doesn't actually fix that. Well, that's at least one perspective on this issue, one way to look at it, but you might look at it differently, okay? I did what I said I wasn't going to do, which is talk about stuff I already talked about. Okay, let's move on. Argument from objective morality. This is another classic argument. And someone who famously proposed this argument, or has a version of it, C.S. Lewis. I've brought him up before. People mostly know him as the author of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? The Chronicles of Narnia. But he wrote other stuff than that, right? The Chronicles of Narnia, by the way, are kind of Christian allegory, right? They're a little bit like Bible stories themselves. If you understand Christian theology, then you see what C.S. Lewis is doing in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? If you remember any of this stuff, remember Aslan, sort of like the god in that world. He appears as a big lion. Aslan ends up sacrificing himself, but then he comes back to life later on. Sounds familiar, right? He also he was also a Christian apologist, like William Lane Craig, Right? He's one of these people that tries to explain why Christianity and theism are right and reasonable, right? And tries to address some of the problems that skeptics have with theism and with Christianity, right? So he wrote a book called Mere Christianity, where he tries to sort of circumvent this problem that we looked at earlier, that there's so many different versions of Christianity, right? So how can you even say Christianity, right? What is Christianity? There's so many different versions. Well, C.S. Lewis proposed that most of all these schisms that exist, they disagree about certain things, and some of those things might be important, but the basics they all agree on, right? That was his argument in Mere Christianity. So Mere Christianity means, well, what are the basics? What is the essence of Christianity, right? So he goes into it. And in that, and in other books as well, he presents this argument, right? Very simple argument. I'll tell you ahead of time, it's a valid argument. That means if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. The problem always is, are the premises actually true, right? So premise number one, right off the gates, many people will not agree with this, right? If God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist. Right? Many people think that that's right intuitively, and again, it's going to depend on who you ask, all right? Are you asking somebody who already does believe in God, or are you asking someone who does not have a God belief? Right? A person who believes in God might be more likely to agree with the statement than someone who does not. But it depends, though. Well, that's premise number one. If God doesn't exist, then objective morality does not exist. Now, objective, one simple little word, but a lot turns on what we mean by objective as well, right? So it's not entirely clear exactly what this statement means right away. I mean, take away the word objective, right? If God does not exist, then morality does not exist. Well, there is such a phenomena as morality, right? It's a natural phenomena that we see in the world. Human beings do impose limits on their behavior, these kind of artificial limits. Right? We don't justify all behavior that as long as it's natural, it's okay. No, we have all sorts of standards and values that we try to adhere to. So morality certainly exists even if God does not, right? So then what are we trying to say with objective, right? We're trying to add something to that. So a lot of this has to do with, well, what do we actually mean by objective? Are we actually adding anything to the idea or not? Well, I think often what goes on with this idea is that God can somehow be a metaphysical grounding of the morality. That if unless an absolute being issues forth these absolute commandments, then there can be no sense in which morality can be objective. I think that's the idea. But morality, if you can study in the field in philosophy, you can study ethics, right? Ethics is all about morality, and there's all sorts of different theories of ethics that exist. For most of these, God does not play any part in these ethical systems. Things like utilitarianism, which says that good actions are those which tend to bring more happiness than suffering, right? Well, I mean, that's a pretty objective way of grounding reality, isn't it? Or grounding morality, right? If that's at least part of being a moral person, is caring about your consequences and how you're affecting people, right? Some behaviors are objectively known to lead to more misery than happiness, right? So it's pretty objective on that sense. If by morally good, you mean something like that, right? That there's overall net result of happiness over suffering, that is to some extent measurable and objective, right? It might be a little fuzzy, but that's different from saying that there's no way to ground morality in any objective facts at all unless it's God. Right? Okay, so far I've presented you the premise, and I've given some reasons to doubt the premise, okay, to keep you updated. Is what in terms of what I'm doing. Sometimes I switch back and forth really quickly between arguing for something and then arguing against it. I hope you've gotten used to that by now. Sometimes that can be confusing, right? Where maybe you think I'm explaining something and you're getting it, and then suddenly I'm turning it around and saying, but that's not right. That happens a lot in philosophy. So I hope that's okay. So premise number one. Premise number two, objective morality does exist. Okay. And again, you might question that after all, right? Lots of atheists do question that. Lots of people think that morality just is not objective anyway, right? So it's all a moot point. Maybe morality is all subjective. Maybe it's all just completely determined by what you think, and there's no other truth behind it at all, right? So a reason to doubt premise number 2 as well. Yeah, oh yeah, and I have a little thing to explain objective, but I talked about it a little bit. So the conclusion, of course, naturally follows then that God exists, right? I hope everyone can see that the logic of the argument is impeccable, right? And this, if you take a critical thinking class, this is something you learn about, that any argument you look at, there's 2 components, right? There's the logic of it, which is basically, do those premises support the conclusion, right? If those premises are true, is the conclusion true? Yes, in this case, yes. The logic part is good. But the premises need to actually be true, right? In order for you to conclude that God exists, you have to first be able to agree with both of these premises. Now, objections obviously then are going to not be a matter of the logical form of the argument, but rather those specific premises, right? So one way then, right, if you were an atheist, right, if you were, let's say, an atheist alien even, where you don't really have any, you know, you're not one of these very biased people, right? There's the common internet trope that we already looked at, right? The neckbeard atheist, the Reddit atheist, the fedora atheist. There's an obnoxious image of an atheist, right? But let's say we're not talking about that kind of a person who's turned their atheism into a religion of sorts. Let's say we're not talking about that. We're just talking about, let's say, an atheist alien, an alien who has no God concept at all. Should they be convinced? Now, right? When they look at this argument, the conclusion says God exists. Should this atheist alien be convinced? Well, not necessarily, because let's suppose that they agreed with premise number 1. Let's suppose you agree with this contentious premise. Let's say you don't believe in God, but you do think that if God doesn't exist, then objective morality doesn't exist. Well, then you simply are not going to accept the second premise, right? Yeah, what religious status are people born as? People argue about this a lot. Sometimes I like to go on, Facebook groups and stuff like that where people argue about this kind of stuff, so I can see how people are thinking. It's very interesting anthropologically, and people argue about this a lot. Some people say children are born as atheists because they're not theists, right? What is a theist? A theist is someone who says they believe in God, right? Babies can't say that, right? So babies are born atheists. So in one sense of the word, babies are atheists, right? But in another sense, that's weird to say because they don't really have views or beliefs about the world at all, right? So why characterize it in any way, even in this negative kind of way? It's kind of a weird thing. Yeah, born a-religious, yeah. But then, again, it depends on who you ask. I know in Islam, you don't hear this as much in Christianity, but in Islam, it's common to say that everyone is born a Muslim, right? So we can say that from outside of the religion that we're all born a-religious, but from within the viewpoint of some religious systems, no, you're actually born a Muslim and you only kind of move away from it, right? If you end up being a non-Muslim, it's because you've moved away from your natural state of being. Let's see. Yeah, maybe a belief in lack of belief, but it depends on what kind of atheist you are, right? So if you're an alien, an alien, that's a weird example, right? Because that's not a normal way of applying the label. It's kind of a weird thing anyway. But you can imagine an alien from a society that has codes of ethics, that has history and science and literature and all that, but they simply have no God concepts. I would think you would say technically they are atheists, right? Because they're not theists. But that's harder to say about, like, a baby, for example. So it ends up being a semantic thing. I think it's better to stop arguing about what the correct application of the term atheism is and simply explain what it is you're trying to say, right? So you could simply say, well, children are not born with any specific beliefs about whether or not God exists, right? That's what you're trying to say. Then we don't have to argue about, are children born atheists? That just ends up being a word that gets in the way of the meaning, right? So just explain what you mean with a full sentence if you have to, if there's a lot of contention about the application of a term. But yeah, it is interesting to think about a belief in a lack of belief. Yeah, I don't know. Is it? I mean, you take some other lack of belief example, right? Unicorns don't exist, something like that. Is this a positive belief in some way? Do I believe in my disbelief in unicorns? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Then you can ask that question about any kind of belief or non-belief, right? Believe in a lack of believing a belief. But I'm not sure. I mean, then do you also believe in that belief? That you believe that you lack a belief? Yeah. How many iterations of belief do we have, right? Does every lack of belief imply some positive belief? I just don't know. I don't know. Yeah, that happens with any word, right? You say it often enough. Anyway, let's move on here. So, let's suppose an atheist, whatever kind of atheist, whether it's someone who has made up their mind that God probably doesn't exist, or somebody who simply does not have a belief in God, but is, quite open to the possibility, an atheist of either stripe, they could agree to premise number one, but if they did, obviously they're going to disagree with premise number two. So this argument is not going to convince them. It wouldn't make any sense for this argument to convince them. Right? You're asking them to agree with premise number one. Well, if you ask an atheist to agree with premise number one, you're also asking them to disagree with premise number two. So it just is not going to work if you're trying to convince someone who's not already a theist. Right? If you already believe in God, again, this argument will look nice and beautiful and clean and obvious. But if you are trying to get convinced, this is not going to do it, right? For the reason that I said. You'd require an atheist to be inconsistent. Right? But of course, premise number one could simply be false. Right? There are ways to ground morality in objective facts that don't involve the supernatural. Right? Like utilitarianism, I already mentioned, deontology, virtue ethics. These are different ways in which philosophers who have thought about the nature of morality have tried to think about how it all works, and none of it really makes reference to a supernatural being. Right? In fact, if you get an ethics introductory ethics book, very often they'll look at divine command theory first. Divine command theory is the idea that morality can only come from God, right? But usually in an intro to ethics book, that will be taken care of first because it doesn't work for a variety of reasons. And then it gets into these more meaty kinds of well thought out theories that try to actually explain how morality works. So if you have any familiarity at all with ethics as a field and the different ways in which you might try to ground moral claims, you're not going to agree with premise number one. Right? So premise number one might just not be a good premise. Okay, that's the argument from morality. Hopefully you could see the basic idea, right? Again, you could say it in a more homespun way, a more folksy way, just by saying that without God, there is no morality or something like that, right? Without God, nothing is good or right. If God is dead, everything is permitted, is the famous saying, right? That's what people think. And it may be true, of course, that there's no authority to ultimately enforce all of ethics. If that's all you mean, that might be true, right? If there's no heaven or hell to punish people or anything like that, if there's no cosmic justice, without a God. Maybe that might all be true, right? But that's not the same as saying that there's no objective difference between torturing a child and helping someone across the street, right? We can recognize the difference between different types of actions. And the language that we use is just, well, one is good, the other one is not good, right? We're pretty agreed on that's the right way to use moral language. Now, of course, there are moral disagreements, and we can get into that. But the presence of moral disagreements is not itself enough to show that morality is subjective. Okay, but that will be part of the argument, right? So here, how to respond to this argument? Well, there's so many different ways an atheist could, right? So for one, it just depends already. Do you believe that ethics are subjective or in some way objective? You know, and well, both kinds of atheists exist. Yeah. So, well, what Parker is saying, right? But the theist won't say that, right? So if you're just a Christian theist, then you will say that, well, no, even the atheist knows right and wrong, but it's because of God, right? So the Christian theist won't say that atheists, some say this, but people who are careful will say, no, even atheists can be good and do good things, but it's only because of God, right? And if God didn't exist, then yes, if God didn't exist, then we would all be like that, right? Yeah. Okay, right. Okay. Yeah, so again, it depends on what background assumptions you're bringing to the table, right? For all these arguments, for any philosophical arguments, how you evaluate the argument is going to depend on your background information and what you're willing to revise, what you're not willing to revise, and so on, right? So all I can really say about this argument is it's unlikely to rationally convince someone who doesn't already believe in God, because there are too many problems with the argument the way that it's set up. The main one being, right, the one that I pointed out. If an atheist is evaluating this argument, they simply cannot agree with both premise number 1 and 2, right? If somehow you find yourself agreeing with both of those premises, then maybe it's time to change your mind, right? So if you're an atheist who really is more sure about premise 1 and premise 2 than about their belief that God doesn't exist, or about their lack of belief, then it starts to look like a rational argument, a reasonable argument that might change your mind. But it really is going to depend on a lot of different factors. Okay, leave that one there. What about arguments from religious experience? Right. This is a big one for many people, right? And it's kind of impossible to argue against it, right? Especially if you don't want to become a cynical person who thinks that everybody's just lying. And I don't think that. I think people really have transcendent experience, religious experiences. But I mean, I also believe that people who take hallucinogenics can have profound mystical experiences, right? So I tend to believe people. I know some people exaggerate their experiences and some people are just liars. But I think there's at least, a large percentage of the people that say that they've had these amazing experiences that are difficult to put into words. I believe that many of them are telling the truth. Okay? But that's just the data. That's the raw data, right? They had this experience, right? So the argument would go something like, well, people have these experiences that they think are of God, and the argument, it's an inference to the best explanation. Right? The best explanation is that it was really God that caused the experience. Right? So people report religious experiences. This could be a Muslim, could be a Hindu, right? Could be a Christian, right? In our context, that's the closest, right? The most relatable religious believer is a Christian, right? They might say that they experienced God's love, or they experienced Jesus' joy, or they experience the Holy Spirit. And to them, that's going to mean, well, it's like saying, yeah, I know my hand exists. It's right here. I can see it. I have experience of it. Right? They're trying to be empiricists in a way. That's why it's hard to argue with. If you've had an experience that to you, at least subjectively, cinches the deal, that you think, no, I have experienced the Almighty, the creator of the universe. If your experience was intense enough, it's hard to really argue with that, at least with that person, right? All you can really say is, well, they've had an intense religious experience that to them has confirmed their belief. Right? And so to them, this argument is going to make a lot of sense, right? Because basically all the argument is saying, if you've actually had an experience like that, you're basically saying, I know that God exists. I experienced God. Right? The same way that you know other people exist and the natural world out there exists. You have experience of it, so you know that it exists. So that's how these arguments go. And yes, again, I don't know how you try to unconvince someone of their experience. I don't know that you can do it or should do it. I don't know. This is going to be an individual thing. But but the whole problem is that this type of argument is supposed to not just be good for the person who went through the experience. It's supposed to be good enough to convince other people. Right? That's the problem here. Right? So if you are looking at one person's religious experience and they're telling you, therefore my religious beliefs are correct, you also have to look at other people who have had different types of experience, right? And evaluate their claims. Okay, put a pin in that. I did not predict correctly what my first objection was going to be. So for now, look at the argument again. You get the basic idea, right? People have these experiences that to them, subjectively, appear to be of God, the traditional God, right? So in a Christian context, that would be God as described in the Bible, right? They would think that they are having some sort of, especially in more evangelical leaning Christian denominations, right? They believe that they have an actual experience of this God. Right? And therefore, of course, God exists. That's the best explanation is for having an experience of something is that something is real, that it exists, right? But is that really the best explanation? Explanations, right? You can come up with all sorts of explanations for anything. We actually talked about this in our critical thinking class today. We had a whole section on inference to the best explanation. When you're evaluating an explanation, it is important that you look not just at that explanation, but you look at rival explanations. Right? Try to look at all the different explanations that there could be, and then try to assess the relative strength of the explanation. So first, just get a bunch of other explanations out there, even if you end up rejecting them, but at least look at the other explanations, right? For example, right, this is the one that I mentioned at the get-go, which I don't believe. I don't think everybody's lying about their experiences, but it is an explanation, right? It is an explanation that premise number one says people have reported experiences of God. What could explain people reporting something like that? Well, maybe they're lying. And that's the end of it, right? It came out of their imagination. That's one explanation. Yeah, but I think in the long run, that's not going to be an explanation that keeps holding up when you see it over and over and you see people speaking very genuinely about their experiences, right? So I don't think everybody's lying about their experiences, but it is still an explanation that you'd have to eliminate. And in any particular case, you'd have to eliminate that possibility. Right? And you have to think, well, which explanation fits our background knowledge better? Right? Which one is more consonant with what we know about human beings and about the nature of reality? Right? Now, I think everybody is more willing to say that people do often lie, right? That's not a controversial statement. Does the traditional God exist? That's a more controversial statement than sometimes people lie, right? So already, even though I'm not that willing to say that everybody's lying, still, if you think about various explanations, one is just a fundamentally human thing that happens all the time. People lie. They do, right? The other one says, well, in addition to what we know about this physical world, there's also this supernatural being with a mind who created the world and all that stuff, right? Then you're adding way more to the explanation. You're adding a whole metaphysical system that lots of people don't agree with, right? Whereas lying, much simpler explanation, right? But however, I just don't think lying explains it all, right? If everybody's lying, then you would see people just, I don't know. I just don't think that everyone's lying about their personal experiences, right? Yeah, so there's other explanations as well, right? So maybe you're thinking of something like this. It's not that they're lying. And again, I don't like that explanation because it implies that so many people are being dishonest. When a lot of these people who report religious experience are nice people who are not trying to con you, right? Maybe they're expressing a very personal experience that meant a lot to them. So I'm just not willing to say that everyone's lying, right? But there are other ways that it can go wrong, right? We know, for example, that memory plays tricks on us. This is a well-documented phenomena, a psychological phenomena, where stories change in the retelling, right? Where you might remember an extraordinary experience you had, but then every time you rethink about that memory, you're adding more layers to it. We do this in all sorts of contexts. So it wouldn't be a surprise if we did this in a religious or mystical context, where perhaps you had kind of a cool, weird experience, but in time and over time, you add layers to this. This happens as well, right? Or perhaps you're reinterpreting it in some way later on, right? And in fact, interpretation is a big part of it, right? Because again, let's say you have a very intense experience, and for you, you're connecting that to your idea of the divine, but at the same time, you are sort of crossing over from, not only am I having this experience, I'm saying that the best explanation of that is this supernatural being caused it. Right? So you're going beyond merely the experience, right? That's why this is an argument to the best explanation, an inference to the best explanation, right? It's saying, well, not only do we have these experiences, the best explanation is that God caused the experiences. Right? Well, here there are already some other options. You could simply misremember or reinterpret it or misinterpret your experiences. It could also just simply be that people are hallucinating or dreaming, right? This is not really to knock the experience, right, or to denigrate it in some way, but it is interesting to think about the fact that hallucinating is perfectly natural for human beings. We do it every night, right? Right? When you have a dream, that's your brain simply creating an alternate reality for you, right? We hallucinate on a nightly basis. So it seems that hallucination is just a natural human capacity. It is something our brains are able to do. Right? So if we're able to hallucinate on a nightly basis, everyone is able to do that. Then why would it seem so surprising that you might hallucinate in other contexts, or at least have very, very strange experiences? Again, it doesn't have to be that experience or that explanation. But I'm saying when you evaluate an inference to the best explanation type of argument, you have to look not just at the explanation that's being offered. You have to look at rival explanations. And until you can really rule all those out, especially if those rival explanations are simpler and they are more constant, they correspond more to what we know about the world, right? Which in this case, each of these three things are very simple things that we all know happen, right? We know these things happen. This is in the realm of knowledge, whereas the question of the existence of God is obviously more controversial, right? It's debatable whether God exists, literally debatable, because that's what we're doing right now, right? Is it debatable that people lie? No, we know that people lie, right? We know that people hallucinate. We know that people misremember things. These are all things within the realm of knowledge, and these all also explain the phenomena. And this, well, I kind of said this already, right? So perhaps you are having an intense experience, right? Like I said, and perhaps you're even remembering it correctly, right? And perhaps it isn't just a visual hallucination. Perhaps it's something much more transcendent than that, right? You experience something like an absolute love or complete forgiveness or peace or joy, right? There are passages in the Bible that talk about a peace beyond understanding. And we get similar kind of language in some Buddhist literature as well, right? Where the process of meditating and cultivating mindfulness will get you into certain psychological states that are completely out of the ordinary, at least out of the ordinary that we're used to. It's not as though, when we're talking about Buddhism, for example, it's not as though you're hallucinating all sorts of crazy stuff. It's rather that your experience of everyday reality is altered radically from what it normally is. So perhaps people are experiencing these intense sorts of things, or these very abnormal ways of experiencing the world. But how do you know that that has to be God, right? Again, that's that extra interpretive layer that we're adding to it, to the bare experience itself. And again, I'm going to bring this up in a second, but that bare experience itself seems to be something that we see coming up in different religious traditions, right? Different religious traditions have different ways of cultivating these religious states. So you might think it's more about the unlocking these sort of psychological capacities that we have. And then the experiences themselves are very similar from a subjective point of view. It's just that how you understand that experience is going to depend on your religious background, right? So that's what we'll get into next here, right? People have reported experiences of Vishnu. Vishnu is a deity in Hinduism, okay? And again, I'm not going to say that everybody's lying, right? So someone might have had an intense experience, and because they grew up in Hinduism, and those are the gods that they're used to, then when they have this experience, they're going to project Vishnu onto it, and so experience Vishnu, right? That's what we're likely to say, right? Because of course, if you agree with this argument right here, then you should also agree with this. Right? If a Christian says, I know that Jesus is real because I experienced Jesus, then a Hindu who says, I know Vishnu is real because I experienced Vishnu, well, they ought to be on the same ground, right? They're making the same kind of argument, and they're basing it on some intense personal experience. And if we're not going to say that everybody's lying, then we should accept that there are genuine Hindu people who believe their experiences verify their religious beliefs, and there are genuine Christian people who think that their experiences verify their beliefs. But, it doesn't stop there, right? People have reported experiences of Odin, right? Odinism still exists. It's still a thing, right? And people do get really into Norse mythology and take it in a very literal way, and people do talk about their experiences of the god Odin. Okay, this is out there. This exists. So, will we accept this argument? Right? Do you see what I'm getting at? Structurally, these are all the same. People have reported experiences of the Tao. Remember, the Tao is in the religion, Taoism. It can be translated in different ways, but sometimes it's called the Way. It's some sort of principle of the universe, some sort of principle of reality. It's a little bit more like it's not a personal deity the way it is in Christianity or Islam or Judaism, right? But it's still something that's religiously very important, and it's one of these things that you can meditate on the Tao and somehow feel a connection with this principle of the universe that results in a heightened religious state. So, does that mean that the Tao exists as the Taoists describe it? People there. Remember, we looked at some. We talked just a little bit about UFO cults. Right? They're very serious people. You can go find their YouTube channels. Right? You might think that there's a screw loose with them. When I say they're serious, though, I don't mean that. I don't mean anything that contradicts that. I mean they really believe it, right? And also, what they believe is actually, when you get into it, not that vastly different than what the other religions say. It's just we're not as used to it. But this is a thing. People say that they communicate with alien beings. People have these experiences, intense experiences, where they get communications from extraterrestrials. And there are whole religions based around this. HBO just did this documentary on the Heaven's Gate cult, which I always think they were so fascinating. Check it out. Check out the Heaven's Gate cult. Where the leader of the Heaven's Gate cult, for example, was telling his followers that he was getting communications from his old partner who had died a little while ago, and he believed that the partner still existed, was on this spaceship, and was communicating to him, and he was relaying this information to his followers. Okay, so that wraps it up for arguments for the existence of God. Did you want to add anything to it? There are other arguments as well. I just picked some of the most classic ones. So there are other arguments, but these are some of the big ones. Okay, so is there an argument for the existence of God that I left out? The argument from fine-tuning, for example, is one that I left out because it's more or less covered by cosmology and by the cosmological arguments and the argument from design. The fine-tuning argument says that the physical constants of the universe, right, the constants that is described by science, by, say, Einsteinian equations, right, E equals mc squared, you think all sorts of equations, right? Well, if you change any of those equations just a little bit, then the universe as we know it would not be able to exist, right? And if you change other factors just a tiny little bit, there would be no sphere where there would be no place in the universe where life could emerge. So the idea is that it's all too much chance, right? That there must have been an intelligent being to make sure that those constants are just right to create the universe. But I see that essentially as a combination of a cosmological argument and an argument from design. So the objections to those count as objections to that one as well. Okay. Right, yeah. Yes, yeah, scriptural arguments. Yeah, that's true, right? God exists because the Bible tells me so, right? Yeah, yeah. And of course then if you keep that conversation going, it's of course, right, well, how do you know that the Bible is actually all correct? And then it's usually, well, God inspired the Bible, and God can't lie. But of course, you're using the concept of God to explain why the Bible must be true, and you're explaining that the Bible must be true to argue for the existence of God. Right? It's a classic circular argument. Yeah. In most cases, these things will look quite good if you already believe, right? If you're already a committed religious theist. Right? So anyway, let's see. Okay. So yes, arguments from Scripture as well. That's one you hear probably a lot, just from everyday people, right? From everyday Christians who want to convince you or something, or from everyday Mormons, or right, or any everyday. By everyday, I mean I'm not talking about theologians or philosophers, right? The arguments that are presented here are ones that have come up in theology and philosophy over the past millennia, right? These are the classics that we looked at that are supposed to rationally prove that God exists, right? There's a whole other approach here that will come up in just a little bit, which is basically to say that you don't have to prove the existence of God, right? That it's just something obvious that you can simply know is true, and if you don't, there's something wrong with you, right? We'll look at that in a second, but that's called presuppositionalism. Presuppositionalism says that you don't have to defend your belief that God exists. You can simply know that it's true directly, in the same way that you know other things to be true directly, right? That you exist, that other human beings exist. Right? We don't need arguments for those. You just know that they are true, right? So that's one approach as well, which I'll cover that a little bit more in a second. All these arguments are coming from the position of what's called evidentialism, right? So religious thinkers tend to split up between these two kinds of factions, right? There are some religious thinkers who think you do not have to bolster your case with arguments, right? You can simply know that the thing in question is true. Other people think, no. Religious believers should be able to show that their belief is true. They should be able to prove it with good arguments. So, arguments for the existence of God, right? And we looked at some critiques of those arguments, but the critiques don't mean that God doesn't exist, right? I want that to be clear. So if anyone thinks I've been really harsh on each of the arguments, maybe I have, and also I should flag to you, this is where I'm at, this is my critique, but, somebody smarter than me might show me where I've gone wrong, and I'm completely open to that, right? So in all cases, I shouldn't even have to remind you of this anymore. I'm trying my best to give you both of the perspectives as much as I can. Of course, I know what I know, I think what I think, so it's going to come to an end somewhere. But the point here is that we looked at critiques of all these arguments for the existence of God. We looked at criticisms, things wrong with the arguments. None of that shows that God doesn't exist. Right? It just means that if all these critiques are right, if all these criticisms are right, it means that none of these arguments actually shows that God must exist. Yeah. So, to be clear about that. So, we have not showed that God doesn't exist or anything like that. For that, you actually need some positive arguments. Some arguments that try to show that God does not exist or probably doesn't exist. Or, well, the first one is kind of a slight tweak of it. Oops. Parker, were you going to say something? I saw you typing and then I was talking a lot. I can wait a second. Okay, that's all right. Yeah, for and again. So now we have actual positive arguments that try to show that God does not exist. Well, this first one is a little bit different. The first one just has a much weaker conclusion, okay? The conclusion being, well, we shouldn't be convinced that God exists, right? That's a little bit different from saying that God doesn't exist, right? So this is, again, imagine an atheist alien, an alien who is only atheist by default, right? These aliens don't have any religious beliefs, okay? They believe in the universe as a brute fact. They never heard of the idea that a being with a mind exists to create it all. They never heard of that idea, but now they're talking to Earthlings and they're looking at all our arguments for the existence of God. Right? Again, you're supposed to be like that atheist alien when you're evaluating those arguments, right? If you don't already have a positive belief in God, do these arguments push you over the edge to belief in God? This argument says, no, they do not. Right? This argument says the atheist aliens should remain where they are. Right? They don't have to say that God doesn't exist, but they shouldn't be convinced because none of these arguments are really good enough. Right? That's what this argument is saying. There's no sound arguments, meaning there's no really good arguments for the existence of God. If that's the case, then we shouldn't be convinced that God exists, right? If there's no good arguments for this claim, then we shouldn't be convinced of it. It's not the same as saying then we should be convinced that it's false. No, it just means you haven't crossed that threshold, right? Here you are with your beliefs about the world. Should I accept belief in the existence of this supernatural being? Well, none of the arguments really get you there, is what this argument is saying. And since they don't, you shouldn't be convinced of it, right? Just like you shouldn't be convinced that Bigfoot monster exists unless you have some really good evidence. Right, that's the way we take it with other things, right? When somebody argues that something exists, but it's something controversial, right? Do fairies exist? Right? Does Bigfoot exist? Does the Loch Ness monster exist? Well, you probably won't make up your mind about it one way or the other, right? If you're an open-minded kind of person, you don't necessarily want to say, no, definitely not. It's just, I mean, I'm not convinced that the Loch Ness monster exists. Who knows? Maybe it's there, but so far I have not seen any good evidence of it, right? Is Bigfoot real? Maybe, but so far I've not seen any evidence, so I'm not a Bigfoot believer. So the aliens in the same way might say, well, maybe this God that humans talk about exists, but these arguments are not good enough evidence. So that gets you to a very weak kind of atheism, right? This kind of atheism where you're simply not convinced that it's true. Which is different from saying, you know what? I don't think God exists at all, right? It's slightly different. So that argument does not establish the non-existence of God, right? It's a kind of a weak argument. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that's why I always flag this first example. It doesn't quite fit. I have to have that overall rubric, right? Arguments. That just goes nicely. Arguments for, arguments against, right? But yes, this first one is not exactly against the argument, against the existence of God. Yeah. Yeah, it's more against belief in the existence of God. Right. Okay. That's the first one. We just shouldn't be convinced of God's existence, just like we shouldn't be convinced of Bigfoot's existence, unless there's really good reasons to accept that it's true. And from this argument is saying that none of the arguments are really good enough. Right, oh yeah, here I use the dragons as an example, right? I use Bigfoot, but we also could, if you're making a map of the world, you shouldn't write, here be dragons, unless you have a really good reason for thinking that there's really a dragon, right? And in the same way, on the mental map of your world, this argument is saying, right, you should not write on it God exists, unless you have a really good reason to believe that that's true. And the argument is saying we don't have any good reasons. All these arguments for the existence of God, there's deep problems with all of them. Right? That's what this argument is saying. Right? Objections to that? Well, you might say that premise number 2 is false, right? This idea that there's no sound arguments, right? The idea that all the arguments we just looked at, they're all bunk, none of them work. Well, you might not think that. Right, and indeed that's true. Right. Again, if you're a theist, if you already believe in God, you are much more likely to think that those are pretty good arguments. So you might simply reject premise number 2. Right. If you're already a theist, you might not agree with this premise, this idea that there aren't any good arguments for the existence of God. Right. You might simply say that that's false and that there are sound arguments for the existence of God. Or maybe premise number 1 is false. Right? This is that presuppositionalism that I was talking about. Why should we think that atheism is somehow the default position, right? Remember, I imagine these atheist aliens, right? Because in my mind, I'm like, okay, well, to evaluate these arguments objectively, maybe we need someone who isn't already convinced one way or the other, right? But that requires a kind of atheism because it's a weak atheism. We need these aliens to not be theists, right, in order for them to objectively evaluate the arguments. But you might say, well, you're stacking the deck then, right? It's a little bit like saying, well, what if you had aliens who don't believe in love, or don't have a concept of love, and we try to convince them that there is such a thing, well, that might be a little bit more difficult, right? Maybe they won't be convinced. So maybe we're stacking the deck unfairly. Maybe, in fact, theism is actually the default position for human beings. And for lots of people, that's the case. For lots of people, belief in God is just, it's not just one belief among others. It's rather, it's a kind of a belief that envelops your entire worldview, right? So not only is it belief in God for some people a default position, meaning that's the position they start with, right? That's simply where you start. God exists, and we go on from there. But also, the God concept becomes this filter through which everything is seen, right? It becomes the thing that imbues your life with meaning, even, right? So, in a way, this analogy between belief in God, the traditional God, and belief in Bigfoot is a disanalogy, right? I know, yes, internet atheists often like to say that kind of thing, right? Oh, well, there's no evidence for Bigfoot, there's no evidence for God. It's the same kind of thing. Well, not quite, right? Because Bigfoot, we could take him or leave him, and it's not going to change our overall view of the world all that much. Right? You're just adding another inventory to your mental map. But God, for a religious believer, at least a religious believer to whom the religion is truly alive and really means something to them, which again does not describe every religious believer, but for the true believer, the religion is not, what the religion says is true, for example, God existing, it's not just another thing you put on the map. It's rather the grid for the whole map. It's the thing that unlocks it all, right? It's not just one more belief that you could give or take. No, God belief for a religious believer is central in such a way that everything else gets organized around it and filtered through it. So it might not be that simple, right? And I'm sympathetic to that point of view. Is that perhaps the best filter, if we need a filter anyway. I remember we looked at Kant. Immanuel Kant's whole point was that we have these conceptual schemes through which we filter information and the world around us. Perhaps we're best off with a conceptual scheme that has God as part of it, right? That's what a presuppositionalist might say, and they might say that, in fact, we naturally believe in God. And belief in God is a properly basic belief, is what the philosopher, theologian Alvin Plantinga says. Right? That a properly basic belief is beliefs that you don't have arguments for, right? Things that you must simply accept to get around in the world. Again, things like, we looked at this classic problem, right? How do I know that other human beings really exist, right? How do I know that I'm not just the only person there and you're all figments of my imagination, right? The viewpoint of solipsism. Well, if you start out like that, you can't argue your way out of that. You get stuck in the solipsistic point of view. You can't prove that other people exist and other people have minds. But it is a natural belief that we have, right? That other people exist and have minds. We don't argue our way to that belief. We start out with that belief. And in fact, it's hard to see how you could be a baby and then a young child growing up without having a natural belief that there are really people out there with their own feelings and their own point of view. Right? We naturally assume that, but we don't have an argument for it. Right? So belief in other people, it's a properly basic belief on this point of view. It's something you naturally do, and it's something that you're justified in doing, right? You don't have to prove that other people exist. It makes sense to assume that they do and to live your life in that way. Right? So properly basic beliefs are beliefs that you don't have to argue for. They're rather like beginning beliefs that you need in order to do anything in the world. Belief in your own that you exist, right? For Descartes, that was the most basic belief. It's something you can simply intuitively know, right? And so perhaps everyone can intuitively know that God exists. And if that's true, then the burden of proof is on the atheist, right? If in fact it's natural automatically to just assume God's existence, and if this is a properly basic belief, then in fact Christians or Muslims, no theist has to really argue for the existence of God. It would rather be that the skeptic needs to really show that theism is false. Yeah. So if that's your approach, yeah, the absence of sound argument doesn't really work, does it? Yeah. And the counterpoint to that is, yeah, what about those atheist aliens? Right? How will they deal with it? Again, though, you might say, well, we've built it into it, these atheist aliens, that they don't have this properly basic belief, right? So we're stacking the deck. Yeah, perhaps. So this is for you to think about, right? Is belief in God a properly basic belief? It's kind of hard because you have to rely on your own phenomenology, right? Phenomenology means the way that things feel for you subjectively from the inside. Is it really the case that most people, subjectively anyway, just know that God exists? That's kind of an empirical question, right? It's an open question, whether or not that really describes most people's experience. But we do know for a fact that lots of people do not believe in God. And we do know for a fact that lots of people at least say they've never experienced anything like what is described in traditional theism. So they do exist. So the way in which a presuppositionalist has to deal with this is they have to say that there aren't really any genuine atheists. I think that's the biggest problem with this argument, right? This way of dealing with the argument, this presuppositionalist move. I think that's the biggest problem. If you're a presuppositionalist, if you think everybody's got a properly basic belief in God, we all naturally believe it, then the only way that you end up saying that you don't believe it is if you're lying to yourself or suppressing the truth in some way, right? That's kind of unpalatable, right? Because you'd have to say that people are not being honest and truthful when they say that they've never experienced or known anything like God, right? This will come back in a little bit. Okay. The argument from evil, it's already 3:20. It's just scandalous how slow I go. It's a lot to cover, right? The argument from evil is a classic one, right? I mean, in a nutshell, it's just if God exists, why is there suffering in the world, right? But here's a classic quote, Epicurus quote. Who knows if he really said it, but it's a quote that comes from antiquity. So people have been thinking about this conundrum for quite a while, right? If you think about God's properties of being omnipotent and benevolent, right, good and powerful and knowledgeable. So there's sort of a puzzle when we look at the world. Right? Is God willing to prevent evil? Right? Supposing evil exists, and let's say evil to make it specific, because evil is so general. So in the whole history of this problem, there's been a lot of issues around the word evil. Let's just go for needless suffering, right? Let's just go for right, children who get cancer, or people drown in a freak accident. Just bad stuff that happens, right? Really bad stuff that happens that we wish didn't happen. If God is willing to prevent those things, but he can't, then God isn't omnipotent, right? If there are certain things that God can't do, right? If God can't cure your cancer, then he wouldn't be omnipotent, right? Is he able? He can do it, but he's not willing. He doesn't want to heal you. Then he's bad, right? Let's say I have the cure, not just the vaccination, but let's say I have the cure for COVID, but I'm not sharing it. You'd call me a bad person, right? If I can use my resources and my power for great good, but I don't do it, you call me a bad person, right? So that's what Epicurus is saying here. Can God, is God able and willing? Does God have the power and the desire to help? Then why is there so much stuff, right? Why is there so much suffering, so much apparently pointless suffering in the world? Or can he do neither? He's not able or willing? Well, then why are you even calling him God, right? If you're talking about a being that is not omnipotent and not all good, that's just another being, right? That's not God. It's not a God worthy of worship or anything like that. You know, so it's a nice kind of poetic way of expressing what the argument from evil is. But let's narrow it down a little bit into an actual argument. And Parker, I'll keep an eye on what you're going to say. So I'm going to put it into this format again so you can evaluate it for yourself. Right? If there is, instead of evil, I'm going to talk about unnecessary suffering. Right? If there is unnecessary suffering in the world, then God does not exist. There is unnecessary suffering in the world. Therefore, God does not exist. So again, it's a logically valid argument. If both of those premises are true, premise 1 and 2, if they're both true, if you agree with both of them, then rationally you ought to accept the conclusion. Right? So if you believe that God exists, then the traditional God, you must disagree with one of these premises. That's the only way you could get out of it, right? So if there is unnecessary suffering in the world, then God does not exist. That does seem to be true, right? If it's truly unnecessary, if there's some sort of gratuitous suffering that isn't good for anything at all, right? That would be weird to square with the idea that there's a God of justice and power and love. That there would just be gratuitous suffering that isn't good for anything, right? Because notice, you can very quickly get around the argument from evil and say that there's so many examples of suffering that actually have a greater good in the long run, right? Some greater results. It would be a little bit like my children thinking I'm not really good because I'm getting them vaccinated, and vaccinations hurts, right? There's suffering, but it's necessary for that suffering, right? Because we don't know how to vaccinate people without that pain. So the pain is just there as a means to an end. We're not really wanting to inflict that pain. It is just a byproduct of what we're doing. So you might say that a lot of the pain we feel in life is justified in that same way, that we don't see the greater good right now. Right? That's why for this argument, I am putting all that to the side. Yes, that's true. There's lots of kinds of suffering that seem to bring out a greater good. But is there any kind of suffering that isn't like that? Let's see. The argument hold, yeah. Yeah, right. So exactly. So this is why it's so, what Parker is saying, I mean, I'm interpreting this as saying basically this argument only holds for the traditional concept of God. Yeah, exactly. And that's why I presented specifically, right, the traditional concept of God. Remember, we looked at deism. Deism is this idea that God created the universe and then just let it go. That God is not involved in human activities at all. Although it's hard to say if that God is a personal being concerned with justice. Maybe it still doesn't work for deism either. But there are at least some God concepts that you could imagine where this doesn't apply. Okay, some groups within Judaism decided after the Holocaust, they decided that God is good and we ought to worship God. Everything. God exists, but God is not all-powerful. Right? After the Holocaust happened, many Jews came to this conclusion that if God could have done anything to prevent these death camps, these absolute horrors, right? If you're not aware of all the stuff that happened in the German death camps, it's just horrendous. It kind of makes sense that if you want to still believe in God, you might have to just say, well, if God could have done anything about that, he would have, but he must have not been able to. right? So yeah, for some people, the problem of suffering has actually caused them to redefine God in such a way that they're compatible, because of the sheer amount of suffering, and apparently suffering without any point to it. I mean, and I get that point, right? Do you really want to say that all that horror was somehow good in the long run, right? That it was somehow justified? So, is there unnecessary suffering in the world? I think premise number one should be pretty uncontroversial. I think that makes sense, right? If there's unnecessary suffering in the world, then God doesn't exist. I think that's an analytic statement, right? God is supposed to be an all-powerful, just being, a being who's concerned with justice, that everything in the world makes sense and coheres, right? This kind of unnecessary suffering wouldn't exist if God existed, right? Now the question is there unnecessary suffering, right? This is where you might be trying to push back if you're a theist. You might say, well, but there isn't any unnecessary suffering, right? All suffering is necessary in some way. So that's the question, right? I think premise number one is analytically true. It's sort of, God existing sort of means that no injustice can really happen. No big long-term kind of injustice anyway. There can be no extraneous, extra evil, extra suffering. If God can do something about it, he would, right? That's what it means to be a good, powerful being. But the question just is there actually any unnecessary suffering, right? So right from the get-go, before I even get into it all, yeah, we'll get into that a little bit, right? It's very common for theists to come up with a defense of God in the face of these kinds of arguments, right? And they will say things like, well, sometimes suffering is necessary for a greater good, right? That's what it is. Unnecessary for a greater good, right? Or unnecessary as the result of a greater good, right? Because you might say that many of the evils in the world are the result of free will, but yet it is still better that we have free will than not have free will, right? That's the free will defense that says that many of the suffering in the world is the result of free will. But free will is good, right? So suffering is necessary in order for us to have free will in that sense. There are problems with that as well, but I think we'll get to that in a little bit anyway. Okay. So you can think about the first premise as well, but I think it's easier if you sort of accept it and go along with it, because the real question is premise number two. Right, that there is unnecessary suffering in the world. If you're already a theist, if you believe that God exists, then it sort of just follows deductively that there is no unnecessary suffering in the world. Right? So, again, the arguments look different depending on your starting position, right? Depending on if you're already a theist or an atheist. So, is there unnecessary suffering in the world? Well, think about some cases of suffering. Right. Yes, it would mean that, right? Yeah, suffering for the greater good. Yeah, it means that God is somehow allowing certain bad things to happen in order for a greater good to emerge that would not be possible without that suffering. Yeah, perhaps. I don't know. There's two ways to respond to it, right? To the point of view of a traditional kind of religious theist. They would say, no, it doesn't mean that, right? Directing, well, I guess it depends on what you mean by pure free will, right? Because nobody thinks we have pure free will anyway, right? We know that there's lots of things we can't do already, so we're already limited in what we can't do. But I'd have to see that spelled out more, Parker. You might have something there, but I think I might have to see it spelled out more to really get it. It may. Right, I see that there's some sort of fatalism going on or some sort of determinism going on. Yeah, certainly the idea that suffering is necessary because it's a result of free will. Well, that's a bit weird, isn't it? Free will is supposed to mean that it is possible for human beings to always choose what is right. So if that's the case, then evil is not necessary. Suffering is not necessary, right? It's a result of our bad choices, I guess, but it wouldn't, strictly be speaking, be necessary, right? This gets into a whole interesting thing that'll come up in a little bit, actually, which is the idea that God could have chosen to create the universe in which human beings always freely decide what is correct. Yeah. Okay, so redirecting our attention to premise number 2, is there unnecessary suffering in the world, right? Are there cases of extreme suffering that just are, well, you can't say anything good about them, right? Are there cases like that? There appear to be, right? But again, if you already have God in the back of your mind, you'll always be telling yourself, no, there must be some reason, there must be some justification, right? I've known 2 families who lost their young toddler in a drowning accident. Lots of people drown. Lots of kids drown. And in fact, kids are a good example because it's one of those things where it's just about inevitable. If a child who cannot swim falls in deep enough water without any adults around, most of the time they just drown, right? Now, of course, if you were a person and you were nearby, you would never think to yourself, well, maybe it's better if they drown. Maybe there's some greater good, right? No, you would, especially if you, no harm to yourself, no risk to yourself, reach out your hand and save that child. Of course, if you were there, if you had the power to do it, you would do it. Right? It would be the right thing to do to rescue the drowning child. In order to say that drowning children is necessary, that this is necessary suffering, you'd have to say that God, in all these cases where children are drowning without humans around to rescue them, is thinking that it would be better for the child to drown, that this would be the better thing to do, right? It would be better to allow the child to drown. That's a weird result, right? But that's what you'd have to believe. Right? Because again, if there are no helping humans around, then 9 times out of 10, a child who falls in a child who doesn't know how to swim, who falls in deep enough water, will simply drown. Right? 9 times out of 10, if not 99 times out of 100. So even if you think that every now and then maybe God is miraculously rescuing a child, that's the exception to the rule. The rule is if children fall in water unattended, they drown, right? That means that in most cases, God is allowing this to happen. In most cases, is not intervening. Strange, right? Because we would intervene, but then you'd have to, as a theist, then you'd have to start thinking, well, if I wasn't here, God wouldn't be doing anything. Now, for many people, this starts to sound like you're shifting the blame or something, right? That, well, where were the parents? They should have done it. They should, why would you be blaming God for it? None of this is really blaming God. Notice, again, these arguments are coming from the perspective of an atheist already, right? These arguments are coming from a perspective where they think God probably doesn't exist, right? So they're not thinking, well, God exists, but why isn't he doing anything? How bad of God? They're saying, no, God's the complete inactivity, the lack of children being saved from drowning, the fact that children mostly just drown in water, means that there's no God actively involved in the world trying to help, right? That's what it means. So it's not the same as blaming God, right? Right. These kinds of systemic issues that exist all over the world. And again, you might want to say, well, human beings should help, right? Why are we pointing the finger at God? Yeah, it's true. But of course, there are lots of human beings helping. But there's still going to be extreme examples of this kind of egregious suffering that exists all over the world, right? Especially when you think about children who have done nothing to deserve any of this. Children who are just born into the world. Some are just born into poverty and starvation and disease. And many of these children die before they even get a chance to live a full life. Yeah? That can all seem a bit pointless, right? Yeah, I understand, right? I'm a runner. I like to run. There's something difficult about running. There's sort of a pain involved, but then you get the long term kind of effect, which is really nice. So we can come up with all sorts of examples where a little bit of suffering is good. But do you really want to say that this is really actually good and fine, right? And if you were in a position to help, where it was very easy to help, but you didn't, then we would call you not a good person, right? Yeah. These are pictures taken at these death camps, right? These World War II German death camps where they were rounding up Jewish people, right? Taking Jewish people out of their homes, deporting them to these big death factories where they're forced to work with a very small amount, if any, of food, under horrible conditions, horribly degrading conditions, and then they work until they can no longer work, until they either die or they're so weak that they can't work anymore, and then they either get shot or gassed in the chambers, and then their bodies are just piled on top of each other like objects. Yeah. Well, you could see why Jewish people, a certain percentage of them anyway, concluded that if God does exist, he can't be the traditional God of great power, because this is just too much, right? It's too much. It's too much suffering. We get some suffering is good for some greater good, but this looks like just insanity. It just looks like human beings are just running the show, right? It looks like there is no oversight from above. There's nothing making sure that we human beings aren't making an absolute disaster of it, right? It doesn't look like that. It looks like whatever being exists is not intervening, if there's some sort of being that exists. And so it's hard to attribute both complete goodness and complete power to such a being, right? So you might say the traditional God of theism does not exist, right? And again, for all of these, the arguments against the existence of God, if you think they're really harsh, remember they only apply to this traditional definition. There are other definitions that it might not apply to, right? So if you think God is just love or something like that, well, love is some sort of impersonal abstract force. Yeah, it might not guarantee that stuff like this does not happen, right? Forest fires are perhaps, now this is shocking. This kind of stuff is shocking to see. And you kind of have to do that for these arguments, right? You have to really, I mean, I don't want it to seem like it's psychologically manipulative, right? I don't want to do that. But these are real images, right? These are real things that really happen in the world, and we should have the appropriate kind of respect for it, at least struggle with it. So even if you are a theist, this has to be a very, very difficult problem for you to struggle with. Even if you don't think it means that God doesn't exist, it's something that you need to square. It's something that's out there in the world. It's true that horrible suffering like this happens without any kind of intervention. You know, and you have to square that. So if you think God is a loving being, well, that's, you know, you have to square those two facts. That's difficult to do. Forest fires, think about animal suffering in forest fires. We've looked at human suffering. Forest fires, think of large mammals like deer that are just get caught in the middle of that fire and burned to death in a painful way. Can you point to any potential silver lining to that? That it's somehow good that the deer went through that suffering? Right? There's no lesson to be learned from this, right? That the deer had to suffer. It doesn't look like there's any, and we don't even know, right? When you have large fires like this, vast quantities of wildlife die. We don't even know about them. So we don't even know who died, which animals died painfully in these deaths. So there's just no way that individual animal suffering had any kind of greater good in the long run. Right? It simply at least does not look like it. Now again, you might insist on it. If you know that God exists and God is all powerful and all good, then it follows deductively that even that suffering must have some reason to it, that it does make sense, even if it doesn't seem to make sense. But that's only if you start out believing that God already exists. If you don't, then you are looking at this in an inductive way, meaning you're just seeing all these cases where there's no God intervening in all these horrible things that are happening. Right? Wars all over the world, right? Children with cancer, right? Children with leukemia or other diseases that end your life prematurely. Just horrible sadness, right? And I understand it's kind of hard to talk about this because one of the things that gives people some hope dealing with this kind of issue is God and God's love, and the idea that you might be reunited with these loved children who die because of diseases. Right? So it's very difficult. At least it should be difficult. It's difficult for me, right, to think about all these different things fitting together right, and I'm not wanting to be psychologically manipulative again by showing these images, but these are things you have to square, right? You have to square the fact that this happens, and the fact that these places often are called, or used to actually be called, places for terminally ill children. There are hospitals that exist that are like that, where it is assumed that 9 out of these 10 kids are not going to make it. Right? Cancer, cancer is all suffering on, at least on Christian theism and Islamic theism as well. It's a result of mankind's fall from grace, right? Adam and Eve doing the fruit thing, disobeying God, put the whole creation out of whack, right? It made the whole creation bad in some way. It tainted everything. And so things no longer work the way they're supposed to work. That's the standard explanation, that things like cancer didn't used to exist, but they were brought into the world by human free will. Remember, we looked at that. We looked at the Bible itself. The Old Testament says that women feel extreme pain during childbirth as a result of this sin of disobeying God. Right? You can pin all sorts of bad things that happen in the world on that. Yeah. But here the point I was going to make is, look, if you're in the United States and you have, animals, right? Yeah. There's that to think about as well. Yeah. Most children that get that have terminal illnesses, by definition, most die. Of course, being that they all live in the United States, most likely each of these children has people praying to God to heal these children. Now, of course, the one child that makes it out of the 100, and everybody says, oh, it's a miracle, right? But of course, statistically, some people do recover. But what about all those other kids, all those other prayers? They seem to fall on deaf ears. Of course, they will make up some sort of reason, right? That God needs another angel, or there is some other greater good that comes out of it. But you sort of have to believe that, right? It's sort of a result of already being a God believer, believing that there's a good God directing everything. Then you just sort of vaguely in your mind think, well, no, it all's got to make sense, even though it's horrible for us now. I just have to trust that it all makes sense. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that human disobedience to God put all of creation out of whack, for lack of a better term. Yes, but I do. That's the standard account. That is true, right? That it does affect the entire animal kingdom as well. Right? It's all of God's creation was. We messed with it by disobeying God. The natural order of things had been disrupted. And so now you have cancer in children and pain during childbirth and animals dying in wildfires, all because we disobeyed God. According to that familiar kind of response to it, right? So objections, well, right? Premise number 2, the idea that there's unnecessary suffering in the world, there are different ways to try to debunk that, to try to say no, that it may look like it's unnecessary, but it's actually necessary. Free will is a big one for that, right? That ultimately all suffering is a result of free will, right? And again, tying that to the biblical story, like we just did, right? All the suffering is a result of free will when Adam and Eve used their free will to choose to disobey God, right? That's the idea. That any kind of suffering which exists, even if it looks gratuitous and unnecessary, it's actually the results of something that is good, free will. Now, it's bad that we use our free will to choose the wrong things because they result in bad things, but the free will itself on this account is good. And it's just out because of free will that we end up going against God's will. We're using our own will to go against God's will. This creates all sorts of problems. Right? This is true in Christianity, and it is also true in Islam. The word Islam means submitting, a submission to the will of God. Right? So in a way, this is like the linchpin holding together these different religions. It's a very important concept that suffering, bad things that happen in the world happen when human beings try to act in ways that are not God's will, but their own will. So that's the free will defense. And then all this stuff is just an inevitable result of doing that. Whenever we freely choose to go against God's will, then there's this potential that this will create suffering, right? That's the standard response. I think a simple response to that is, well, why does that have to be the case? It's sort of set up in this way. Right? We can say, well, it's set up in such a way that if Adam eats this fruit from this tree, then now, thousands of years later, a child will drown in a horrible death. But, I mean, why don't we just question that whole system, right? That seems like a weird system. Why should it be the case that innocent children suffer horribly and don't even get a full life, and their parents get their children ripped away from them because of something that happened that somebody else did so long ago? On the face of it, it doesn't really seem fair. But again, you might think it seems fair if you already believe in God, and then you think, well, it must be fair even if I don't get it, right? That's a large part of this. A lot of these defenses end up being like that, well, I don't know how it works, but God is greater than I am, and he knows it all, right? So it's the same way that, again, babies don't know why somebody's sticking a painful needle in their arm, but there is some reason for it. You might say that there is some reason for it that makes sense of it all. But on the face of it, just looking at it, it does seem a bit odd that the choices that somebody made hundreds of thousands of years ago, that God, a benevolent being, made it in such a way that would later mean that this child who was born into the world full of promise and hope, then suddenly they're 6 years old and they get cancer. Right? That makes sense and that's fair. Right? It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem to make sense. Of course, all this suffering makes a whole lot of sense if God does not exist, right? If God does not exist, that means there's just the natural world, and it's just unfolding, it's just doing what it's doing. Evolution has done what it's done, and now we're in this position where we are these primates who have evolved some sort of moral systems, but of course, things go wrong all the time. The universe does not care about our feelings, right? It's a kind of a colder kind of view, atheism, but at the very least on atheism, it's completely expected that there would be terrible suffering, right? That's just how nature is, and it would be expected that there's unfairness in the world because the universe isn't a being with a mind who can be fair or unfair, right? Fairness, unfairness don't even apply to the physical natural universe. These only apply to the behavior of human beings or some other person-like entity, like a god. If there is no person-like entity with more power than us that exists, then it would make sense that we would see a lot of injustice, a lot of unnecessary suffering, because there's nothing out there guaranteeing anything different. Another counterpoint to free will defense, I think this one's kind of funny. I don't know how seriously you'll take it. I actually think it's quite good. Couldn't God have created beings with free will who always freely choose what is right? Some people will think, well, wait, that just sounds like determinism. That seems like God is making people act right. No, it's not the case, right? Remember, free will is supposed to mean that there's all these alternate possibilities, all these alternate universes where you made some other choice, right? So that means that when God created the universe, he had his pick of possible worlds. God could have picked any of these possible worlds, and in any of those possible worlds, we have free will. On that view, right? On classic theism, human beings have free will, and determinism is false, right? So on that view, it's kind of interesting. When God created the whole universe, he could have created any possible world. He could have created the possible world where all human beings freely choose to do God's will. That sounds weird, that sounds paradoxical, but it really isn't, because look, it happened to be this possible world that God ended up choosing. God could have chosen any of them, but God did choose this one. And yes, according to theism, we act freely, even though God chose this possible universe, right? Oh, interesting. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. Yeah, is that true statistically that it's likely that there's one that's even better for life? I don't know. Yeah, but that would be interesting. I don't know how big of a deal that is, but it would be interesting to think about. Yeah. Uh, right, I see what you're saying. Yeah, yeah. That once we try to square what we know from the natural world scientifically with the way that the theistic worldview has the earth as the crown of God's creation. Yeah, and of course that was already kind of put into some kind of doubt just by the fact that we no longer believe the earth is at the center of the universe, right? We don't even think it's the center of our galaxy or our solar system, right? Once we realize that the Earth goes around the sun, and the sun is just one sun among many different constellations or many different galaxies, we already sort of lost that position. Yeah. Okay. How else might you object to the argument from evil by saying that premise number 2 is false? This, I think, is the biggest response you're going to get, and I've already articulated this. It's the idea of skeptical theism, and that's the idea that we are just not in any position to judge what God would or would not allow, right? So that in fact we can never make this claim that there is unnecessary suffering in the world. There may appear to be unnecessary suffering in the world, the theist might say. Right? Now, of course, if you're an atheist and you say, well, there looks to be a lot of unnecessary suffering in the world, it doesn't look that like there's a powerful being intervening at all, it doesn't look that way, they will conclude, well, then there's probably no such thing. There's probably no such God, right? But if you already do believe in God, then you might say, well, no. Premise number 2 is false, or at least we cannot say that because we don't know, right? We are just these mere mortals, and God is like the super version of us, or we are like a severely downgraded version of God, where we cannot know the mind of God. We are like babies who get shots and go wah wah wah. Why did you do that to me, right? But really, the parent is wise and knows what is happening. Right? So you can get out of this argument from evil simply by saying that we are in no position to judge God's goodness, or the way in which God implements his goodness or fails to implement his goodness, right? We are simply not in a position to make those kinds of claims. So it may look like there's unnecessary suffering, appearances, but those are merely appearances. It just looks that way. But really, it's all part of God's plan. So this is admitting that things look bad, right? It's admitting that things look as though God is not really intervening in a way that we would expect a just, powerful being to do. But it's saying, no, there is some reason, right? So that, yeah, when God, we're talking about God as a personal being in traditional theism, when God sees that a child is drowning, and lets the child drown, as God normally does. Again, that sounds weird to say, but you have to think about this now. If a child falls into non-shallow water, and the child can't swim, and there's no human being close enough to rescue them, then the child will probably drown in most cases, right? And that means in most of those cases, and they happen a lot, and they've happened a lot over millions of years, out of all these children just constantly dying from drowning, you have to think that God has a good reason every time, right? We might not know it, but if somebody drowns and God didn't rescue them, there must be a good reason for it. Yeah, exactly, right. So yeah, and I even allow for that, right? That every now and then, just like when you get diagnosed with a terminal illness and they say, sorry, there's a 99.9% chance, let's say 99% chance that you're not going to make it. That's horrible news, right? That's pretty much a death sentence. If your doctor tells you that there's a 99% chance that you're going to die from this cancer that you have, then you probably will. Of course, 99% chance means that 1 out of 100, that's actually quite a lot after a while, right? 1 out of 100 statistically will not die, right? So again, when you have 99 people dying of cancer, they're all being prayed for, of course. Everybody has some religious relative who's praying for you to God. 99 out of 100 times is not going to do any good. But that statistical anomaly that we already know happens, the doctor told you that 1 out of 100 people does survive when they tell you have a 99% chance of dying. That means that 1 does survive out of every 100. When that 1 does survive, then everybody goes, oh, well, we prayed for them, and then they made a recovery. When really, statistically, 1 out of 100 always makes a recovery. Yeah, so the same thing here with the drowning example. You might think every now and then maybe there's a child who is completely wet, but they manage to somehow crawl out or something like that. And you go, it's a miracle. They fell in the water, but they didn't die. Yeah, but that is the exception to the rule, right? So you have to, I'm trying to get you to look at the rule, right? The rule is when children fall into bodies of water, if they're large enough bodies of water, they tend to drown. So that means that usually God has a good reason to let children drown. But a counterpoint to that is this is a tough pill to swallow. Skeptical theism might look right at first because you're trying to be humble about your position to the Almighty, and that makes sense, right? If God really exists and God is this kind of father figure who is infinitely wise, then yeah, of course, and if it's part of your religion to have faith and to trust in this being, then yeah, of course. On the other hand, once you start saying that you are not really in any position to say anything about what God would or wouldn't do or what God would think is right or wrong, this leads to moral paralysis because then you no longer know what to do, right? If it is true that in most cases God just lets children drown, then shouldn't you wonder, doesn't this become an issue now? If God usually lets children drown, then maybe I should too. Right? Weird, right? But more moral paralysis than that. It also just means, how can you even make the judgment that God is good? Right? Once you've stipulated that God is just so beyond your understanding that you can make no predictive statements at all, then do you really understand what you're saying? Do you even understand what you're talking about in any sense at all, right? So usually if you make a statement like, Parker is a good guy, Okay? Let's just, for the sake of argument, let's say that that's true, right? Say Parker is a good guy. That comes with it a certain set of expectations, doesn't it? Wouldn't that mean, Parker, that if I saw you walking in a park from far away and I saw a child drowning and you just sort of looked over them as they were drowning, I would go, oh, wait a minute, Parker's not a good guy, right? When we say that someone's good, it comes with it a certain set of expectations about what they would or wouldn't do, right? And so when you say God is good, if that is a meaningful statement, shouldn't that mean that you understand to some extent that you can predict what God would or wouldn't do based on the situation? If you're willing to say, no, I can say that God is good without knowing anything about what God would ever do about anything, well, you sort of define God into just a mysterious cloud, right? How can you make any judgments about God at all anymore? How can you say that God is a personal being even anymore? How can you say any of that once you've turned God into this complete mystery that you don't understand? Yeah. So, skeptical theism, this position which says the argument from evil doesn't work because it asserts something that we cannot assert. It says that there's unnecessary suffering in the world. But that assumes that you know the mind of God, that you know what God would or wouldn't do. But in fact, we are in no position to do that. Right? That's skeptical theism. So it kind of gets you out of the problem of evil, but there's a huge price to pay, which is this moral paralysis idea, and just the idea that it becomes hard to take seriously that you would know anything about God anymore. Right? Can you really say anything with any confidence about God once you start saying this kind of stuff? Let's see. Okay, good. Yeah, so I'm glad you're trying to think of counter arguments and going back and forth, and that's a good thing to do. So I'm glad you're thinking of that. Yeah, possibly, yeah. I would say that the claim I'm making is almost like a semantic claim about what's meaningful. I'm being kind of like a logical positivist here, if you remember them, right? Kind of a behaviorist almost, that if you're going to say that someone's good, it at least partially has to mean that you can predict their behavior to some extent, right? At the very least, that they would save a drowning child, right? If you cannot make that cut, then I'm not going to call you a good person, right? But now the skeptical theist is going to have to say, well, we can call someone good, even if they let children drown. It's when it's God. That's when you can say that. Why? We don't know. That's just how it is, right? That's ultimately what you have to end up saying. Yeah. So, back and forth here, right? A way to get out of the argument from evil, but it has its own baggage. Almost done. I'm going to try to get done, okay? If you need to go, you can go. I'm going to try to get done. The argument from non-belief. I'm going to make a couple of background assumptions for this argument to work, okay? One is that the God of traditional theism demands love and worship, okay? Maybe you have a qualm with the word demand, but I don't know. I think that's correct. I think you might even make it stronger and say commands, right? Not just demands, but commands love and worship. If you look at the New Testament, when the rabbis are asking Jesus what the most important rule is in the Torah, and he says to love God, right? That's the primary rule. That's the one thing that, according to the New Testament, God really wants you to know, is that you need to love God. Right? It's a commandment. But of course, in order to love or worship a person, you have to know that they exist. Does everyone... Can you agree with that? You need to at least believe that they exist, right? But you have to actually know that they exist, right? Because you have to believe that they exist, and they have to actually exist. You can't actually love or worship someone, right? So you need to know they exist, they need to actually exist, and you need to know it, and you need to believe it. Well, let me go back for a second. Again, suppose I have a child on the other side of the world that I've never seen, and this child does not know me. But I now have learned about this child, and I want to have a nice relationship with them. And of course, yes, I would love for my child to love me. Worship, not so much. I don't need my children to worship me. Right? But it would be nice. I kind of like God in that way, right? I want my children to love me. Now, of course, if I want that, I can't then just never make contact with them. Right? I can't ever stay out of their life and still expect them to love me if they don't even know about me. Right? That wouldn't make any sense. Right? So if God exists then, and he wants love and worship, then he would want everyone to know that he exists. This is again a personal being, right? Who has desires and values, right? God values our love and our worship, our adoration of him. And God desires for us to do that. Right? And of course, God, being omnipotent, would have the power to let everybody know. And I mean know, right? If God is an omnipotent being, then everyone could know that God exists. So far, I think it's not too controversial, but maybe number 5. But I'm going to say this. It doesn't look like there's any good reason that God would allow some people to not know that he exists. Doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense on the face of it, right? If God wants us to know that he exists because he wants us to worship and love him, then why would God allow lots of people to not know he exists? Okay. Well, those are the background assumptions. That's not the argument. And again, the argument is only as good as the background assumptions, right? And how much you agree with the background assumptions. But here I'm just making them explicit. You might not agree with the argument because maybe you disagree with one of these assumptions, okay? But at least try to get in your mind what it's going for. So, premise number 1, if God exists, then everyone would believe that God exists. Now, perhaps we want to say, not every single person, maybe not babies, and maybe not people with, even people with psychological impairments. Would God not want them to know that he exists? I don't know how many exceptions we can make to this, but just about everyone, it seems, would believe that God exists. But of course, not everyone believes that God exists. In fact, lots and lots of people do not believe it at all. So God does not exist. An interesting way, right? Normally you can't do this kind of argument. You can't say not everyone believes Bigfoot exists, therefore Bigfoot doesn't exist. It doesn't work in that case, right? Because Bigfoot is not like God. Bigfoot doesn't want us to worship us and have the power to let us know that he exists. Bigfoot doesn't have those powers. Only God does. So in this case, it's a little bit different, right? So, again, if those premises are true, then the conclusion is true. So if you disagree with this conclusion, you have to disagree with one of the premises, right? That's pretty obvious, hopefully, right? That if you think the traditional God of theism does exist, then you will have to disagree with one of these premises. So again, premise number 1 is sort of supported by these background assumptions, right? If God exists, well, God defined, God wants us to worship him. And in order to do that, we have to know that he exists. So it would seem to make sense that God would want us to know that he exists. And God also has the power to make that happen. And there doesn't seem to be any reasons that God wouldn't. Then it seems to follow that if God exists, then everyone would believe it. Because God could make us all believe it. Now, I don't mean make us believe us, like force us to believe it. It's just the same way that we believe anything that's just obviously true, right? Actual, properly basic beliefs, right? We don't, there's lots of things that do not rise to this level of of disagreement, right? Yeah, yeah. Well, again, if you do that, Parker, I think you'd be going back and changing uh, the definition of God. But I do have to say, this argument is not a tight deductive argument. Well, this is the way it presented here, but the background assumptions are not. Uh, but yes, yeah. But I would say, well, then that presents this sort of a mystery. It presents something else to try to explain, right? Because yes, someone will have to say something like that, right? That there's some reason that God doesn't do that, that God doesn't use his power to let everyone know he exists. But then when we get into those reasons, some potential reasons would be God doesn't actually want us to worship him, or God doesn't actually want us to love him. Then you'd start contradicting the original definition. But maybe there's some other reason, right? And we will get into that in just a second. I'm trying to hurry up here. So what might be a problem for this argument? Again, if you look at it, it's a logically valid argument. If you agree with the premises, you should agree with the conclusion. If you don't agree with the conclusion, then you must disagree with one of the premises, right? Yeah. You might say premise number 1 is false. Right? Maybe that's not true. If God exists, everyone would believe that God exists. Maybe that's not true, right? Again, you could simply revert back to skeptical theism. I'd say, well, I don't know why why God doesn't just let us all know the truth, right? And again, we know the truth about other things, right? We know that there's a universe around us, right? We're on an earth. You and I both exist. Now, any of those, of course, you could philosophically argue about, but it's not at the same level as theistic belief, which I think everyone will admit is slightly more abstract than our everyday world of experience. Right. So when it comes to our everyday world of experience, we know lots of things are true just directly. We don't feel like we're being forced to believe things, right? I'm not forced to believe in trees. I just see that they're there, right? And if I wanted to, I could come up with a conspiracy theory that says trees aren't real, right? That's true. You could go out of your way, but for the most part, we just know, right? We just believe that trees exist. So why would it not be the case for God's existence? Why does it have to be this kind of game where it's not clear, it's not obvious that God exists? And again, if it were obvious, if it really were obvious, then people wouldn't revert back to faith all the time, right? People end up saying, well, it's just a faith position. If you have knowledge, you don't need faith, right? Okay. So I think I went on a tangent, as I'm wont to do. But anyway, the objection to this argument, one of the objections would be skeptical theism, again, right? Just simply saying, we're not in a position to say that God would tell everyone that he exists, or God would allow everyone to simply know it directly. We're not in a position to say what God would or would not do. And to that, again, you'd have to say, yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, if you're saying that God is so beyond our understanding that we cannot make any of these sorts of arguments about him, right? We can't make any conclusions based on our knowledge of God because our knowledge is so far off from reality or something like that. But there's a huge price to pay for skeptical theism, which is, again, you're basically arguing that God is unknowable and mysterious. But you might also say premise number 2 is false. That's weird. That's a weird one, right? I mentioned this earlier. People do argue this. People really argue that actually everybody knows that God exists. Right? They say premise number 2 is false. Everybody knows it. Deep down, they know it. Right? Everybody really knows it. People are either lying or maybe they're suppressing the idea, right? That everybody knows that God exists, but some people are suppressing that because, there's part of Christian and Islamic and Judaic theism. A big part of it is, of course, is that God wants certain kinds of behaviors from you, the right kinds of behaviors. And you might think that, well, if I just suppress my belief in God, if I just look away from my knowledge that God exists and pretend that God doesn't exist, then I don't have any moral obligations to this being, and then I can just act however I want to act. Right? That's often the way that it's presented. That non-believers are kind of lying, or they're playing a psychological game with themselves. That what they want is freedom to sin, right? Freedom to go against God's will. They can only find that freedom by pretending that God does not exist. Yeah. To that, all I can really say is, well, people genuinely report not believing in God, so you kind of have to. It is a cynical point of view, right? It's a little bit like the point of view that says everyone who says they have religious experiences are actually lying. Right? That's a cynical point of view, and I don't buy that. I think lots of people genuinely report extraordinary experiences, and I think people genuinely report non-belief. This is a difficult issue to get into, right? But you're sort of saying that you cannot believe people when they tell you they don't believe in God. They're lying to you. They really do believe in God. Nobody who ever says that is actually telling the truth. Now, that's unbelievable to me, right? Having met plenty of genuine, as far as I could see, atheists, right? I don't see that's what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't seem probable that everybody's just lying about their non-belief. Right? And especially when you consider people who are very much into their religion and they don't even have a classic God concept, right? Are all those Taoists who are living according to the precepts of Taoism and who barely know anything about Christianity, are they really the whole time just suppressing their knowledge of this personal deity? It seems so unbelievable. That's all I can say about that. It seems that it is true that not everyone believes that God exists. I think there are genuine atheists. But you could see why someone would be pushed into a corner to have to say this, right? If you are so committed to theism, where God wants everybody to love and worship him, if you're committed to that, then it does become really hard to explain why there are so many people that don't believe in God. Right? And that's what this whole argument is about. This whole argument from non-belief. It's, if you don't want to say it as an absolute knockdown argument, it's, at the very least, it's a puzzle. If God is a personal being who wants everyone to believe and know that he exists, why is it the case that so many people neither believe nor know that God exists? One way to explain that as a theist, if you do believe in God and that God wants love and wants us to know that he exists, one way to do that is simply to say, well, here's an explanation. People are actually lying, right? People actually do believe that God exists, but they're suppressing it. That's one way to get out of this puzzle, one way to get out of this conundrum, right, of non-belief. And again, yeah, maybe some people are very motivated. Maybe some people turn their atheism into a religion. Maybe some people just had bad experiences with religion and they're lashing out. Maybe those people exist, but there do also seem to exist people who simply go about their daily lives who don't see any evidence or reason to think that a personal creator deity exists. That's hard to square with the existence of a personal deity who wants to be recognized and loved. So how do you get out of that? Well, this is one way to do it. Just deny that people are ever atheists. Okay. One more, two more. No, maybe I should stop because it's so late. Or at least I'm giving you all a blanket permission to leave right now because it's getting very late, right? I'm going to quickly get it done just so I have the video up and I can say that I got done with this segment. But if you need to go, I understand. Okay. Another argument against the existence of God basically is that God is self-contradictory. That the definitions that we looked at of God at the beginning, that many of them might contradict themselves. One example being that God is supposed to exist essentially beyond space and time. God is not limited to the temporal realm, but God also essentially, right, has desires and thoughts and reacts to events in real time. like answering prayers and feeling disappointment, things like that. Right? We talked about the tension within, already we talked about this tension between the very abstract notions of God and the more personal notions of God, right? The more anthropomorphic. Well, we see that here coming up as a problem because they are in tension with one another. If God really exists, if God is really a person, essentially, then it would seem that he would have to be limited to the temporal realm, because to be a person is to have thoughts and feelings in time, reacting to the world. If you're some sort of timeless being where nothing is really happening in your mind because things happens within the temporal realm, right? It happens within this dimension of time. If God exists outside of that, there's nothing sort of happening in the mind. So what does it even mean to say that God is a person if he's this completely atemporal being? So God is not sort of seeing the world go by the way we do. God just has a snapshot vision of the entire world, but in a completely timeless way. What does that even mean anymore, right? How can you say that a being can exist beyond space and time, but also has essentially, as part of its nature, these temporal qualities that are associated with having a mind, or with being a mind, or being a person, being an agent? It may seem as though these are both mutually incompatible, and a self-contradictory being can exist, right? It's a problem if our definition of God contradicts itself. That's not good for any definition. So God does not exist. God can't exist. It's not logically possible for God to exist. If this argument is correct, right? If it's really true that being a person with a mind and feelings and emotions and desires and values and a will upon which you act, all these things require a temporal context. Right? But of course, God is supposed to be essentially a person even before God created the universe, right? Even before there was any time. Well, how could that be? How could you be a personal being existing completely outside of time? They seem to be logically incompatible. Yeah. In a way that has to do with, it's almost like an analytic falsehood, right? We talked about analytic truth, things that are true in virtue of meaning. There are some things that are false in virtue of meaning, right? So God existing, for example, you might say is false by virtue of meaning, because you can't be both a timeless being and a person at the same time. Because what it means to be a person can only be explained in the temporal context. And that's our only understanding of personhood. We only know about personhood and having a mind and things like that within this temporal context, by having experience of our own minds and knowing that other people have minds and explaining their behavior thereby. It all happens temporally. You can't conceive of personhood and agency outside of this temporal context. Right? So this argument is saying God cannot have it both ways. God can't both be a timeless being and a personal being. To be a person is in some way to be limited by time. And if you start to stretch personhood outside of that natural context, it's hard to say what you're talking about anymore. Right? You're using a word, but do we know what you mean? Right? When you call a timeless being a person, an agent? I don't. I don't know what that would mean. Right? So it seems as though within the definition of God, the traditional definition anyway, there's a contradiction lurking, right? Okay. But you might say no. You might disagree with the argument. You might say premise number 1 and 2 are not incompatible. You can actually exist beyond space and time. But you'd have to understand what that would actually mean. You could say it. But this is not so much a statement about what's possible or what's likely to be true, right? This whole argument about conceptual incoherence is not so much about that. It's more about the meanings of the terms involved. That if you're going to call someone a person, that comes with a certain set of expectations. And these all have to do with being limited by time and space, right? Maybe not space, but at the very least, time. It's hard to know what a mind would even be if it were completely timeless and static. Yeah. Like you might insist that somehow it's possible. I don't know. You might also say that premise number 2 is not literally true. Right? We've seen this, and I've mentioned that theologians, even within the traditional tradition, that's redundant, even there, some have flirted with the idea that this idea of personhood does not apply literally to God, that these are just human ways of relating to this transcendent being. So you could basically soften the definition of the traditional God to take that personal element out of it. Yeah, that's definitely an option. That's a way to get out of it. If you say, well, no, God is the source of all reality and a transcendent being and beyond our understanding, and we should not think that God is a person, right? We're just projecting our own understanding of ourselves into the mysterious, right? Into the great mystery of being, right? You might say. So I think this is a fine route to take, but it almost ends up collapsing into atheism, I think, right? Once you take the personal element out of it, what are you left with? Right? So you could do that, but you would not be dealing with the traditional God. You would not be dealing with a God who answers prayers. You would not be answering with the God that they talk about in church, right? The God that comforts you when you're down, and the God that gives your life meaning and cares about you and all that stuff. You wouldn't get that with a non-personal being, a non-personal God. Okay, here's the last one. I think this one's kind of fun. One of these days I'm going to rearrange the argument in a different format. I'm presenting the format that this guy Justin Schieber himself presented. He's a writer. He writes about theism and atheism quite a bit. Talks about arguments pro and con. He came up with this argument. The way it's formulated, I don't love. I think you could do it in a different way. But it's basically the opposite of a cosmological argument for God. This is a cosmological argument against the existence of God. Very strange, right? Usually people go, well, look at the universe. God must exist. How else would you explain it? We got into all of that, right? Understand that regardless, you're going to have to believe in a brute fact that something explains but has no further explanation. That could be the universe as we know it. It could be God, whatever it may be. There's some end to explanation that we call a brute fact. My thought got away from me again. This is happening more lately. It's an end of the semester thing. Usually I can tie back my thought neatly and nicely, but it's all right. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so let's just imagine a state of affairs. Let's call it God world. Now you think about what it would have been like when the physical universe didn't exist yet, right? On traditional theism, God created the universe, and this was an actual event in time, right? So you might think about, well, at one point then, it was just God. Right? God was all there was. Okay. Let's call that God world. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Now, if God exists, right, if the traditional God, as defined by traditional theism, exists, then God world would actually have to be the best world that there is. Ignore the unique part for now. Just think, it would have to be the best possible world, right? Imagine God existing in isolation, without a physical universe, without us, without sin. Simply God exists. Well, God is already defined as completely perfect and infinite, and embodying all the good that exists maximally, right? God is just completely full of being and goodness and power. This state of affairs, with where just God exists, is perfectly good. There's nothing wrong with it. Nothing. This is all just by definition. right? This all comes from the definition of God. Since God is not limited, and God is all good, and God is the highest degree of reality that there is, well then, of course, the way that the way that reality is when just God exists is perfect. Right? Don't change a thing, you're perfect, is what we would say, right? Well, if that's true, right, if God world would be the best place, if that's by definition just the super best place ever, the best thing ever, right, because God is, by definition, then God would simply maintain the maximal goodness which already exists, because it doesn't get any better than that. Right? And God, again, is good, so a good being would want to maintain maximal goodness. Well, a good being like God already has maximal goodness, so all God would have to do is maintain that maximal goodness, and the world would be perfect and beautiful and great. Now, of course, if God simply maintained that status quo, right, this world where just God exists, and again, it's perfect, there's nothing wrong with that world. You have to, right, a theist will have to agree with that. That world, if reality is just God, there's nothing wrong with it, because God is completely perfect. So if God is just maintaining that status quo where just God exists, there wouldn't be anything outside of God. There would be no objects that God created extra that weren't already there. There would be no non-God objects, right? There would only be God. There would only be one big God object. And it's a perfect state of affairs. However, right, this is where the cosmology comes in, where you look around and you see a universe around you with lots of non-God objects. Right? Here's the non-God object. Here's the non-God object. All these non-God objects everywhere. Well, then God doesn't exist. Right? If God existed and he was perfect and he wanted to maintain perfection, then he would never have to change anything. There would be no reason to. And in fact, God would know that if he did anything, if he created a world with human beings with free will, that they would just mess it up and create a horrible world, right? Well, there's lots of good stuff in the world too, but we're just looking at all the evil and suffering that exists, right? God would know that to create the universe then would be to degrade the reality which already exists. Again, the universe would already be perfect, maximally good. Everything that is good or could be good already exists, pure and with the utmost intensity within God, right? So this God universe would be completely perfect. And there would simply be no reason that God would make anything different, because making anything different would only dilute that perfection. So if God exists, if he does exist, we would not expect to see a universe, at least not a universe in which there's lots of imperfection. Well, but we do see a universe with lots of imperfection. So that means the traditional God does not exist. Again, if he did, we wouldn't be here. Right? If God was perfect, he would never have created anything. Of course, you can come back. Let's see. Yeah, I want to skip over that, but oh no, that's it. That's all I was saying about that. I didn't want to talk about this point. I wanted to talk about another point that I was going to make. Yeah, let's see. Let's go back here. Okay, do you get the basic idea? I'm just about to wrap up here. It's a funny thing. I was kind of like in awe of the argument because I never really thought about this, right? Usually the existence of the universe is meant to be an argument for God's existence. But here the existence of the universe is an argument against God's existence. Because again, a good God would not intentionally bring evil into the world or degrade the perfect goodness which already exists within God world. There would be no reason for God to create the universe. He's not making anything better by creating the universe, right? God is already better than the universe. God is not adding to the quality of reality by creating anything. But of course, if God is a good being, then he would only use his free will to maintain goodness and to create goodness. God would never do anything to degrade the quality of reality. But by creating anything outside of himself, God would be doing that. And in fact, we all agree, most of us anyway, there are imperfections in the world, and the world is not the best it could possibly be. Right? Whereas if God existed, that's the way it would be. Right? Unless you want to argue that it's somehow better to have a universe than to not have one, but then you'd have to say that God wasn't already perfect. So what do? Right? You either have to accept this argument, say God doesn't exist, or you have to think that God is not perfect. And God somehow needed to create the universe to make the world better. That's a weird place to be for a theist, right? If you have to say something like that. Yeah, right. And that would be incompatible with God as a good being, right? That's the whole thing. Is, you might want to come up with reasons and go, well, God did it just for fun. It's like, well, does God need to have fun? He's already perfectly satisfied, right? God is supposed to be so perfect in every way that we might as well bring that back to the contradiction between different definitions, right? God is so completely perfect. This is why some theologians have said God can't really feel disappointment or anger. Those all imply a kind of imperfection. If God is perfectly perfect, and we do mean that perfect to the utmost degree, it's hard to see how God would have any kind of emotions, let alone, oh, I really want to do this. I really want to create a universe, or I want to create humans to share my love with. That's a very common reply to this sort of thing, right? That God created the universe to share his love. But God wouldn't need to do that. God already exists to a maximally perfect degree by definition. If you want to say that to create a universe which can love him would make the world better, would make God world better, then you've admitted that God world wasn't already perfect. So it's hard to get out of that one. There would just be a non-God object is anything that isn't God, right? Yeah. So a God object, maybe you call God an object, but that's not what it's trying to say. It's just trying to say there are objects in the world, and these are not God, right? Yeah. Again, because the physical world is not a perfect being, right? Yeah. So the upshot of this argument is we would not be here if God existed. The fact that we exist, the fact that the world is imperfect, means that God does not exist, right? But in a different way than the argument from evil, right? In a different way, this argument is saying go back way to the beginning. If you imagine simply God existing perfectly, in a perfect state of perfection, lacking nothing, there would be no reason that God would create anything. For to create anything at all would be to degrade that perfect state that the universe, the world would be in. Right? In fact, that is what happened. Right? If God had created the universe, all he would have done is diluted his own goodness. Right. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and you might say this argument does not address pantheism, right? Because maybe this is the best of all possible worlds, as Leibniz put it, right? Leibniz was kind of a pantheist. He did kind of believe something like that, and he did believe that this is actually the best of all possible worlds. That's not traditional religious theism, though, right? Which says that God is perfect in himself, separate from his creation, right? This argument is saying that God would never be a creator. He would not create the universe because he would already be perfect. The whole world would be perfect. There would be no reason to do anything. Yeah, I don't know how you can quantify the best world either. No, it's true. But for this argument to work, you don't really have to, because that's supposed to be the theist's premise, right? The theist is the one saying that God is perfect. in all ways. So the theist is already committed to God world being the best world that there is. That's just part of the religion, right? That's part of the faith, right? Is that God is perfect, and so a world in which only God exists would have to be completely perfect. It would be the best world, by definition. Again, by definition. Even if we can't quantify exactly how that would work. Okay, let's be done there. Yeah, exactly. We do that. That happens a lot when we're sort of saying like, well, let's say if God did exist, right? Then it would be like this. If that's like this, then this is like this, but this is not like this, so God does not exist. Yeah. Yeah, a bit like that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Based on your definition of God, right? Based on the definition of God, this would have to be the case. This is what you'd have to deal with, right? Okay, so I thought that was a fun one because it's an unusual, we don't see this argument a lot, but I think it's actually quite good. Even if you don't agree with it, but something for you to think about. Oh my God, I can't believe it's almost 5 o'clock. Everyone should go now. I can't believe you stayed this long. Thank you. And we will do one more meeting. I'll go over some stuff on Tuesday, okay? Okay. Good. I hope it's... I hope this whole section isn't too annoying for people. I hope it sheds light on things. I hope I'm doing it in a respectful way for everyone concerned, right? But I figure no matter which side you're on, you're getting a little bit of the other side, right? So, and that's a good thing to open your mind, is to be aware of more perspectives. Even if you don't change your mind, but just to be aware of different perspectives, I think is good. And that's all I really want from this, right? Even if you can kind of guess where I'm coming from, right? Even so, I'm not telling you to believe what I believe or to think what I think. Maybe you can't guess, by the way. I've taught a whole philosophy of religion class before where people did not know what my position was, which I consider a success, right? I want to hide myself as much as possible and just sort of give you the points of view for you to think about. Okay, bye. Again, bye.